An original werewolf story, written by Wicked Serenity. Romance. The night Thalia's parents burned alive, she was 14 years old, covered in her newborn brother's blood, and unable to scream. Not because she didn't want to, because she couldn't. The blood moon eclipse that had cursed her at birth had stolen her voice along with her hearing, leaving her trapped inside a body that could witness horror but never express it. So she watched their cottage collapse into flames with her baby brother clutched against her chest, his newborn wails the only sound in a world of silence, and she couldn't even cry out for the mother and father dying in the inferno. The villagers said they deserved it. Said Lysander's birth under the full moon was the final proof that their bloodline was cursed, that they brought misfortune to the Umbral Crescent Pack, that mercy would be allowing the fire to consume them all. They were wrong about mercy. For 4 years after the burn, Thalia had to survive on scraps and silence, keeping Lysander alive through sheer stubborn refusal to let this world take anything else from her. 4 years of watching her brother waste away from an illness no healer can name, his small body growing weaker while she grows harder, colder, more desperate. 4 years of stones. They threw them every Tuesday, market day, when Thalia and Lysander came begging for food. The first stone always hit her shoulder, the second, her ribs. By the third, she'd already grabbed Lysander and run, his fevered body burning against her chest, his shallow breathing the only sound in her silent world, as rocks pelted her back, and the villagers' mouths formed words she couldn't hear but understood perfectly. Cursed, abomination, deathbringer. She couldn't scream when the stones broke skin, couldn't beg them to stop, couldn't explain that Lysander was dying, that they needed food, that they were just children trying to survive. So she ran. Every Tuesday. Ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave out and Lysander's small body went limp from exhaustion. Then she'd hide in whatever shadow would take them, behind abandoned buildings, under bridges, in the forest, where even the pack wolves wouldn't venture. And she'd hold her baby brother while he coughed blood onto her threadbare dress and wonder how much longer she could keep him alive. Stubbornness doesn't cure fever, doesn't feed starving bodies or heal damaged lungs. And yesterday, when Lysander collapsed while trying to walk to the stream for water, when his lips turned blue and his eyes rolled back, and Thalia thought, truly thought, she was watching him die, something inside her shattered. She'd screamed then, not with her voice, because she had none, but with her wolf, Nyx, who howled so loudly inside Thalia's mind that her knees buckled and she collapsed beside her brother's body, pressing her forehead to the dirt, begging gods who'd never answered her for just one more day. 1 more hour, 1 more breath. Lysander had survived. Barely. But Thalia knew, the way you know the sun will rise, or that winter follows autumn. That time was running out. So when she saw the notice nailed to the market post, written in careful script that took her an hour to decipher, announcing that the Umbral Crescent Pack House was hiring maids, she didn't hesitate. She couldn't afford to hesitate. Because desperation doesn't sound like crying or begging. It sounds like footsteps walking towards certain humiliation, because the alternative is burying your 4-year-old brother and living with that weight for whatever hollow years you have left. And now she's standing at the gates of the pack house, the place where wolves with titles and bloodlines live in stone towers, while orphans like them rot in forgotten sheds. She's here because they're hiring maids, because she'll scrub floors and empty chamber pots and swallow every humiliation if it means getting coin enough to buy medicine, to buy time, to buy her brother 1 more day of breathing. She doesn't believe in the moon goddess anymore, doesn't believe in divine plans or destined mates or the idea that suffering makes you stronger. She believes in survival, in doing whatever it takes to protect the one person she has left. Because girls like her don't get happy endings. They get used, discarded, forgotten. And she's already made peace with that. Chapter 1. Thorns of maidens crowded the pack house gates. At least 60 of them, maybe more. Young women dressed in their finest clothes, hair carefully arranged, faces painted with determination, and barely concealed desperation. They pushed and jostled for position, their voices creating a wall of sound Thalia couldn't hear, but could feel in the vibrations through the ground, in the aggressive energy radiating from bodies pressed too close together. The announcement had said 10 positions. 10 maids selected from however many showed up to compete. 60 hopefuls for 10 positions meant 50 rejections. Thalia stood at the very edge of the crowd, her back against the cold iron gate, trying to make herself invisible. She wore the only dress she owned that wasn't held together entirely by patches. A faded, blue thing that had belonged to her mother, still smelling faintly of smoke even after 4 years. Her dark hair was braided as neatly as she could manage without a mirror, and her face was scrubbed clean with water from the stream. She looked poor, but presentable, until someone actually looked at her. Moon's Mercy, is that the cursed girl? Thalia didn't hear the words, but she felt the shift in energy as heads turned toward her. A blonde in green silk pointed directly at Thalia, her face twisted with disgust. A red-haired girl in yellow laughed, her mouth forming exaggerated shapes Thalia could read even from this distance. What is she doing here? Does she think they'd actually hire her? Another girl, this one in blue, with elaborate braids, covered her mouth in mock horror. Can she even clean? I heard she's deaf and mute. Completely useless. The mockery spread through the crowd like wildfire. Girls who'd been strangers moments ago united in their shared target, their faces bright with cruel amusement. The cursed Omega thinks she deserves to work in the pack house. Someone should tell her she's only good for one thing: dying quietly. I heard her brother is dying too. Good riddance to bad bloodlines. Heat crawled up Thalia's neck, burning her cheeks, tightening her throat. But she kept her chin high, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes fixed straight ahead. She'd survived worse than their mockery. Stones hurt more than stares. But then someone shoved her. Thalia stumbled forward, barely catching herself before she fell. She spun around to find a tall brunette glaring at her, her lips moving in sharp, angry bursts. Go home, cursed girl! You don't belong here! Another shove, this time from someone else. Then another. The crowd of hopeful maids became a circle of predators, pushing her between them like a rag doll, their laughter visible in the way their shoulders shook, their eyes gleaming with casual cruelty. Thalia's wolf, Nyx, snarled in her mind. Shift. Fight them. Make them bleed. But shifting would only prove them right, would only confirm she was the wild, dangerous thing they believed her to be. So Thalia endured. Let them shove her. Let them laugh. Let them have their moment of feeling superior to someone even more powerless than they were. The gates opened. The crowd immediately stopped, straightening their clothes and fixing their hair, their faces transforming from cruel to demure in seconds. A woman emerged, sharp-featured, wearing black wool that fell to her ankles, her iron-gray hair pulled back so severely it made her face look skeletal. Her expression suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. Morgana, head of household. Thalia recognized her from the market. She'd walked past Thalia begging for food 3 weeks ago, without even glancing down. Form a line, Morgana commanded, her voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. Thalia couldn't hear the words, but she read them from the sharp movements of Morgana's mouth, from the way the other girls immediately scrambled to obey. Single file, no talking, no fidgeting. If you can't follow simple instructions, you've already failed. The girls formed a line with aggressive efficiency, shoving each other in their haste to be near the front. Thalia ended up at the very back, which suited her fine. Fewer people to stare at her. More time to prepare herself for rejection. The selection process began. One by one, girls were called forward. Morgana asked questions. Thalia could see her lips moving, see the girls responding with varying degrees of confidence. Some were dismissed immediately, their faces crumpling as they walked away in shame. Others were told to wait to the side, their expressions carefully neutral, but their eyes bright with hope. 9 girls selected, 9 positions filled, 1 position left. Thalia counted the remaining girls ahead of her. 12. 12 girls competing for one final position. Her odds had never been good. Now they were impossible. The line moved slowly. The sun climbed higher, turning the morning cool into afternoon warmth. Sweat trickled down Thalia's spine despite the autumn air. Her stomach twisted itself into knots so tight she thought she might vomit right there in the dirt. "Please," she prayed to gods who'd never listened. "Please let me pass. Lysander needs this. I need this." Girl after girl was rejected. Morgana's standards were exacting, her judgment swift and merciless. The rejected girls walked away with slumped shoulders, some crying openly, others tight-lipped with rage. Finally, after what felt like hours, only 2 girls remained ahead of Thalia. Then 1. Then none. Thalia stood at the front of the line, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, her hands trembling despite her best efforts to still them. Morgana looked up from her parchment, her eyes landing on Thalia. Something flickered across her face. Recognition, definitely, and something darker. Satisfaction, maybe? Like she'd been waiting for this moment. Her lips moved, forming words Thalia couldn't hear. A question, based on the upward inflection at the end, the expectant tilt of Morgana's head. This was it. The moment everything fell apart. Thalia pointed to her ears, then her mouth, then shook her head slowly. The universal gesture she'd perfected over years of trying to communicate her limitations to people who didn't want to understand. "I can't hear. I can't speak." Morgana's eyes narrowed dangerously. She said something else, slower this time, her mouth exaggerating each word like she was speaking to a particularly stupid child. Thalia repeated the gesture more emphatically, then pressed her hands together in that pleading motion she hated. "Please, I can work. I can clean. Please, give me a chance." Morgana's face transformed. Anger flooded her features, turning her pale skin red, making her lips thin to nothing. Her mouth moved in rapid, furious bursts, her hand slashing through the air in sharp, dismissive gestures. Thalia didn't need to hear the words to understand their meaning. "You're unqualified, worthless. How dare you waste my time?" Morgana turned to the 9 girls waiting to the side, the ones who'd been selected, who'd passed the test Thalia would never be given, and said something that made several of them laugh. Their eyes slid to Thalia, bright with mockery, their mouths forming words that cut deeper than any stone ever had. Then Morgana looked back at Thalia, pointed toward the gates with one sharp, dismissive gesture, and turned away. "Leave." Thalia's vision blurred. She tried to gesture again, tried to communicate that she could work, that she didn't need to hear to scrub floors or haul water, that she'd work twice as hard as anyone else if they'd just give her a chance. But Morgana had already turned her back, already walking toward the pack house with the 9 selected girls following like obedient ducklings. Like Thalia didn't exist. Like she'd never been there at all. Nyx howled in rage inside Thalia's mind, the sound so loud and anguished that Thalia's knees buckled. Bite her. Make her see you. Make her acknowledge what she's taking from us. But violence wouldn't save Lysander. Wouldn't get Thalia the position she desperately needed. Wouldn't change the fact that she was exactly what they all believed her to be. Worthless. She'd failed before she'd even been tested. Thalia walked toward the gates on legs that felt like water, her chest so tight she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process anything beyond the crushing weight of failure. The rejected girls had already dispersed, walking back to their homes, to families who would comfort them, to lives that held other possibilities. Thalia had no other possibilities. No family to return to except a dying 4-year-old who was counting on her. No home except a shed with holes in the roof. No future except watching her brother waste away because she couldn't earn 2 copper coins a week. So she didn't walk away. She couldn't. Instead, she sat. Right there, beside the pack house gates, in the dirt, with her back against the cold iron and her knees pulled to her chest. She should leave. Should go back to Lysander. Should figure out some other way to get money. Should keep moving because staying still meant giving up. But she had nothing left. No strength. No hope. No fight. And for the first time in 4 years, since the night she'd watched her parents burn alive while clutching her newborn brother, Thalia cried. Not silent tears, not dignified grief, but ugly, gasping sobs that racked her entire body, making her shoulders shake and her chest heave, her face buried in her arms, her fingers digging into her own skin hard enough to leave marks, her wolf keening inside her mind in shared agony. She cried for Lysander, who'd never asked to be born under a cursed moon, who'd never done anything wrong except exist. For her parents, who'd died trying to protect children the world deemed unworthy of protection. For herself, for the girl she'd been before the blood moon eclipse stole her voice, before the fire stole her family, before the world taught her that survival was the best she could hope for, and even that was asking too much. She cried until she had nothing left, until her throat burned, and her eyes swelled, and her chest felt hollow, until the grief and rage and desperation emptied out of her, leaving behind only numbness. And she didn't hear the footsteps approaching, didn't know someone was there until a shadow fell across her, blocking the afternoon sun, and a hand, warm, gentle, impossibly careful, touched her shoulder. Prince Cassius had been returning from the training yards when he saw her. He'd spent the morning sparring with the warriors, working through forms and drills until his muscles burned and his mind finally quieted. It was the only thing that helped anymore. Physical exhaustion so complete, it drowned out the constant noise of pack politics, of his brother's silent wars, of expectations he never quite managed to meet. Beta Theron walked beside him, discussing supply routes and border patrols in that methodical way of his. Cassius made appropriate sounds of agreement without really listening, his mind already drifting to the reports waiting on his desk, the 100 small crises that demanded his attention. And then he saw her. A girl, no, a young woman, sitting in the dirt beside the pack house gates, her body curled in on itself like she was trying to disappear. Her shoulders shook with sobs violent enough that Cassius could see them from 50 feet away. Something in his chest twisted painfully. He'd seen plenty of rejected servants over the years. It was an unfortunate reality of pack life. Not everyone could be hired, and disappointment was part of the process. But this girl wasn't just disappointed. She was devastated, broken, like someone had reached into her chest and torn out everything that mattered. And every person who walked past her, servants, guards, even other rejected applicants, looked away. Pretended she didn't exist. Cassius's wolf stirred restlessly beneath his skin, agitated in a way he didn't quite understand. Not the violent, claiming instinct he'd heard other wolves describe when finding their mates. Just discomfort. Wrong. The sense that something wasn't right and needed to be fixed. "Who is that?" Cassius asked, his voice rougher than intended. Theron followed his gaze, his expression darkening. "One of the girls who came for the maid positions, I'd guess. Morgana finished selections an hour ago. Why is she still here?" "She was probably rejected. Most of them leave right away, but sometimes..." Theron shrugged. "Sometimes rejection hits harder than others." Rejected. Someone had looked at this girl, this devastated, sobbing girl, and decided she wasn't good enough. The wrongness of it made Cassius's teeth clench. "I'm going to see if she's all right," he heard himself say. Theron's eyebrows rose. "My lord, I don't think..." But Cassius was already moving, his feet carrying him across the courtyard before his mind fully caught up with his body. His guards scrambled to follow, their boots crunching on gravel. He stopped a few feet from her, suddenly uncertain. She hadn't noticed him yet, too lost in her grief to sense his approach. Up close, she was even more heartbreaking. All sharp cheekbones and tangled dark hair, wearing a dress that had been mended so many times it was barely holding together. She looked like she'd been surviving on scraps for years, like the world had tried its hardest to break her and almost succeeded. Cassius crouched down slowly, carefully, making himself smaller so he wouldn't loom over her. Then he reached out and touched her shoulder, his hand barely making contact, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wanted. She jerked back like he'd burned her, her head snapping up, her eyes, gods, her eyes, wide with terror. They were the most striking thing Cassius had ever seen, dark and deep and filled with so much pain it made his chest ache, and they didn't track his mouth when he spoke. "Are you all right?" he asked gently, watching her face carefully. She stared at him, her expression cycling rapidly through fear, confusion, and something that might have been hope before settling on wary resignation. Then she pointed to her ears. Her mouth, shook her head. Understanding hit Cassius like a fist to the gut. She was deaf and mute. "You can't hear me," he said anyway, more to himself than to her, his mind already racing through the implications. She shook her head again, more emphatically, then made a gesture he didn't understand. Hands pressed together, then opening outward. Pleading, maybe, or apologizing for something that wasn't her fault. Cassius looked up at his guards. "Did any of you see what happened here?" One of them, a young warrior named Kellen, shifted uncomfortably. "She was in line for the maid positions, Prince Cassius, but Morgana dismissed her without testing her, said she was unqualified because..." He trailed off, glancing at the girl with something like pity. "Because she's deaf and mute," Cassius finished, his voice deadly calm. "Yes, my lord." Something cold and furious settled in Cassius's chest. Morgana had looked at this girl, this clearly desperate girl who'd come begging for work, and dismissed her without even giving her a chance. Had sent her away like she was worthless, beneath consideration. It was cruel. Unnecessarily cruel. And Cassius had never had much tolerance for cruelty. He turned back to the girl, who was watching him with wide, uncertain eyes, like she couldn't decide if he was going to help her or hurt her. The fact that she had to wonder told Cassius everything he needed to know about what her life had been like. He stood slowly, then extended his hand to her. An offer, not a demand. She stared at his hand like it might be a trap. Like kindness was so foreign to her that she couldn't recognize it. After a long moment of hesitation, she slowly pushed herself to her feet without taking his hand, wobbling slightly, her legs clearly unsteady from sitting so long. She kept her distance from him, her body angled like she was preparing to run if necessary. Smart. She'd learned to be careful. Cassius gestured toward the pack house, then at her, trying to convey, "You. Coming with me." Inside, her eyes widened. She shook her head frantically, pointing at herself, then, making that same gesture again, ears, mouth, head shake. "I can't hear. I can't speak. They don't want me." "They will want you," Cassius said firmly, knowing she couldn't hear but hoping his tone would carry meaning. "Because I'm going to make sure of it." He turned to Theron, who'd finally caught up and was watching the entire interaction with barely concealed curiosity, mixed with something that looked like approval. "Get Morgana," Cassius commanded, his voice dropping into the authoritative register he'd learned from watching his brother rule. "Now, and tell her to bring her selection records." Theron's eyebrows rose, but he nodded. "Right away, Prince Cassius." As Theron hurried toward the pack house, Cassius turned back to the girl. She was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Part fear, part confusion, part desperate, fragile hope. He gestured again toward the pack house, more gently this time, trying to communicate that she should wait, that he was going to fix this. She didn't move, just stood there trembling slightly, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold her broken pieces together. Cassius had no idea why this girl, this stranger whose name he didn't even know, had gotten under his skin so completely. Had no idea why the sight of her crying had made his wolf restless and his chest ache. Had no idea why he felt compelled to help her when logic said he should just let pack hierarchy sort itself out. But he knew injustice when he saw it. And he knew he couldn't walk away and leave her sitting in the dirt, abandoned and broken. So he waited with her in silence, standing between her and the gates, a wordless promise that he wouldn't let anyone send her away again. Several minutes passed. The girl's trembling gradually slowed. Her breathing evened out. She didn't come closer to him, but she stopped looking like she was about to bolt. Then a door slammed open. Morgana emerged, her face flushed with anger or exertion, clutching parchments to her chest. She saw the girl and her expression turned venomous. Cassius stepped forward, placing himself between Morgana and the girl, his body language protective without being threatening. "Prince Cassius," Morgana said, her voice tight with barely controlled irritation. "I was told you requested my presence urgently." "I did." Cassius gestured to the girl behind him. "You rejected her from the maid selection?" "Yes, she's deaf and mute, completely unqualified. You didn't test her." Morgana's jaw tightened. "There was no point in testing her, my lord. She can't hear orders or respond to questions. She'd be useless in any household position." "That's not your decision to make." Morgana blinked, clearly not expecting to be challenged. "My lord, with all due respect as head of household, staffing decisions are precisely my—" "Not when those decisions are based on prejudice rather than capability." Cassius's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath it. The same tone he'd heard his brother use when shutting down elders who overstepped. "You dismissed her without testing her ability to clean, to follow visual instructions, to perform any of the actual duties required of a maid. You judged her solely on her disabilities. Because her disabilities make her incapable of performing those duties. Prove it." Morgana stared at him. "What?" "Test her. Right now. Give her a task and see if she can complete it. If she fails, I'll accept your decision. If she succeeds, you'll hire her as one of your 10 maids." Morgana's face cycled through several emotions: shock, indignation, calculation. She glanced at the girl, who was watching the exchange with wide, uncomprehending eyes, clearly unable to follow their conversation. This is highly irregular, Prince Cassius. Consider it a direct order from a member of the royal family, then. Cassius crossed his arms. Test her. Or explain to my brother, the Alpha King, why you're refusing a direct order from his brother. The threat was clear. Morgana could fight him on this, but it would mean escalating to Corvinus, and no one wanted to bother the Alpha King with petty household disputes. Morgana's lips pressed into a thin line. Fine, but when she fails... If she fails, you can say, I told you so, for the rest of the year. I'll even put it in writing. For the first time since this interaction began, Morgana smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. Very well, my lord. Follow me. She turned and marched toward the pack house. Cassius looked back at the girl, who was still standing frozen, clearly having no idea what had just happened. He extended his hand to her again. This time, after a long moment of hesitation that felt like an eternity, she took it. Her hand was small in his, calloused and rough from hard labor, trembling slightly. But she held on, and Cassius led her through the gates, into the pack house, toward whatever test Morgana had planned. He had no idea if the girl would pass. But at least now she'd have a chance. And that was worth fighting for. You're absolutely right. I rushed it and summarized instead of showing. Let me rewrite. Chapter 2. Morgana led them deeper into the pack house, her black skirt swishing against stone floors so polished Thalia could see her own reflection. Thin, hollow-eyed, desperate. The corridors stretched endlessly in every direction, lit by torches that cast dancing shadows on walls, decorated with ancient pack symbols Thalia didn't recognize. Behind her, Thalia felt Cassius's presence like a warm pressure at her back. Not threatening. Protective, maybe. Though she couldn't understand why a prince would care about a cursed servant girl he'd found crying in the dirt. They passed other servants who stopped and stared, their mouths forming words Thalia couldn't hear but could imagine. Who is she? Why is Prince Cassius escorting her personally? What's happening? Thalia kept her eyes down, her hands clasped in front of her, trying to make herself small, invisible. The way she'd learned to survive. But invisibility was impossible with a prince walking behind her. Morgana stopped in front of massive double doors, carved oak reinforced with iron, depicting wolves in mid-hunt, their teeth bared, their prey fleeing. She pushed them open with both hands, and Thalia's breath caught. The dining hall was enormous, easily 50 feet across, with a ceiling that soared 2 stories high. Long tables stretched the length of the room, their surfaces covered in weeks' worth of accumulated grime. Candle wax, spilled food, sticky rings from goblets. The floor was worse, stone flagstones dulled by dirt and neglect, corners thick with dust and debris. Against the far wall sat a massive oak sideboard, its surface covered in tarnished silver, platters, goblets, candlesticks, serving dishes. Dozens of pieces all blackened with age and disuse. This wasn't a test. This was punishment. Morgana turned to face Thalia, and the smile on her face was pure malice. Her lips moved, forming words slowly and deliberately so Thalia could read them. Clean. Everything. 1 hour. Thalia's stomach dropped. 1 hour. To clean a dining hall that would normally take 4 maids an entire day. To scrub floors on her hands and knees. To polish silver pieces that looked like they hadn't been touched in months. It was impossible. Morgana knew it was impossible. That was the point. Thalia looked at Cassius, hoping, what? That he'd intervene? Tell Morgana this was unfair? But his expression was carefully neutral, his arms crossed over his chest. Watching. Waiting. He'd given her a chance. The rest was up to her. Morgana gestured sharply toward a corner where cleaning supplies sat. A battered wooden pail, a stack of rags so worn they were barely holding together, a brick of harsh lye soap, a few stiff brushes. Not even proper cleaning tools. Just the bare minimum to make the task technically possible. "Begin," Morgana's lips said. "We're watching." And they were. Morgana settled herself on a bench near the door, her back straight, her expression expectant. Cassius remained standing, his face unreadable. And through the open doorway, Thalia could see other servants gathering, the 9 girls who'd been selected properly, older household staff, guards, all of them waiting to watch the cursed deaf-mute fail. Nyx snarled in Thalia's mind. "They want us to fail. They want to laugh at us. Prove them wrong." Thalia's hands were shaking as she walked to the cleaning supplies. Her chest felt too tight, her breathing shallow. Every eye in that hallway was on her, measuring her, judging her, waiting for her to break. But breaking was a luxury she couldn't afford. She thought of Lysander, of his fevered body in their shed, his shallow breathing, his blue-tinged lips, of the 2 copper coins per week this job would bring, of the medicine she could buy, the food she could provide. Lysander needed her to pass this test, so she would pass it. Thalia filled the pail from a water barrel in the corner, her movements methodical despite her racing heart. Added a generous scraping of lye soap, enough to cut through grease, but not so much it would waste time rinsing. Grabbed the least worn of the rags and the stiffest brush. Then she began. She started with the tables, working from the far end toward the door, away from Morgana's watchful eyes, giving herself space to think, to plan. The wax came off in chunks under her fingernails, sticky residue that made her stomach turn. She scrubbed in tight circles, using her body weight to apply pressure, ignoring the way her shoulders burned. Don't waste movement. Don't waste time. Every second counts. When the first table gleamed, she moved to the second, then the third. Her hands were already raw from the lye, her fingernails broken and bleeding. But she didn't slow down. Couldn't slow down. The floor was next. She dropped to her hands and knees, scrubbing in wide arcs, working backward toward the door so she wouldn't have to walk on cleaned sections. The stone was cold and unforgiving against her knees. Dirt ground into her palms. Sweat dripped from her chin onto freshly scrubbed flagstones. Through the haze of exhaustion, Thalia became aware of the silence in the hallway. Not literal silence, she couldn't hear anything, but the quality of watchfulness had changed. The mocking expressions on the gathered servants' faces had shifted to something else. Surprise, maybe. Or confusion. She was actually doing it. The silver came last. Thalia's arms trembled as she lifted the first piece, a massive serving platter so tarnished it looked almost black. She worked the polish in with the rag, using circular motions, applying pressure until her arms screamed. Slowly, agonizingly, the silver began to emerge from beneath the tarnish. Bright. Clean. Perfect. One piece. Then another. Then another. Her vision started to blur around the edges. Her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped a goblet. Her breath came in gasps that burned her lungs. But she kept working, kept polishing, kept moving. Because stopping meant failing, and failing meant Lysander died. When she finally set down the last piece of silver, a candlestick that now gleamed like captured moonlight, Thalia realized she couldn't feel her hands anymore. Couldn't feel much of anything, except bone-deep exhaustion that made the room tilt sideways. She looked up at Morgana, her vision swimming, and waited for judgment. Morgana's face was a mask of fury. She stood slowly, her movements jerky with barely controlled rage, and walked through the dining hall like a general inspecting a battlefield. She ran her finger along table surfaces, crouched to examine floor corners, held silver pieces up to the light, turning them, searching desperately for flaws. But there were none. Every surface gleamed. Every piece of silver shone. The dining hall looked better than it probably had in months. Morgana's lips pressed into a thin white line. She turned to the assembled servants in the hallway, her expression venomous, and said something that made several of them shift uncomfortably. Then she looked at Thalia, and the hatred in her eyes was so pure, it was almost physical. But she couldn't deny reality. Her lips moved, each word clearly painful to form. You passed. Relief hit Thalia so hard her knees buckled. She caught herself on the edge of a table, breathing hard, her vision still swimming. She'd done it. Somehow, impossibly, she'd done it. She was hired. Lysander would get medicine, food, a chance to survive. Thalia looked at Cassius, and before she could second-guess herself, she brought her hand to her chin, then swept it forward, the sign for thank you she'd taught herself years ago when words stopped being an option. Cassius's expression softened. He nodded once, acknowledgement without judgment, respect without pity. And for one perfect moment Thalia felt something she hadn't felt in 4 years. Hope. Then the pack house bell tolled. The sound reverberated through the stone so powerfully that Thalia felt it in her chest, in her bones, in the soles of her feet. A summons. A call to assembly. Every servant in the hallway straightened immediately. Fear flickered across faces. Even Morgana's expression shifted from fury to something more careful. Her lips moved rapidly. First call. Alpha King, Great Hall. Now, all new maids, follow me. The servants began moving like a coordinated organism, flowing toward the Great Hall in practiced formation. The 9 selected maids fell in line behind Morgana, their faces pale, their movements careful. Thalia hesitated, unsure if she was supposed to follow, until one of the girls, the blonde in green silk who'd mocked her earlier, turned and gestured sharply. You too. Move. Thalia fell in at the back of the line, her exhausted legs barely supporting her weight. They moved through corridors that grew progressively wider, more ornate, until they emerged into a space so vast it made Thalia's breath catch. The Great Hall. It was a cathedral of pack power. The ceiling soared 3 stories high, supported by massive stone pillars carved with wolves and moons. Stained glass windows cast colored light across floors of polished marble. Torches burned in iron sconces, their flames casting dancing shadows that made the carved wolves seem alive. Warriors lined the walls, at least 100 of them, maybe more. All dressed in leather armor, weapons at their sides, their faces hard and watchful. Older servants clustered in groups near the pillars, their expressions grave. Pack members of rank stood near the front, their fine clothes marking them as important. And at the front of the hall, on a raised dais, stood the Alpha King. Thalia's first thought was that he looked like violence personified. He was tall, easily the tallest person in the room, with shoulders broad enough to block out light. His hair was black as midnight, falling to his shoulders in waves that probably looked careless, but were anything but. His face was all sharp angles and harder edges, high cheekbones, a strong jaw, a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. But it was his eyes that arrested her. Even from this distance, they burned with an intensity that made lesser wolves look away. Pride. Absolute, unshakable, dangerous pride. This was a man who'd never questioned his right to rule. who'd never doubted his own power, who looked at the world and saw only things to conquer. Beside him stood a woman so beautiful she didn't look real. Golden hair that caught the torchlight and threw it back like captured sun. A face that could have been carved by artists. A crimson dress that clung to curves designed to drive men to madness. She stood with one hand resting possessively on the Alpha King's arm, her violet eyes surveying the assembled pack like a queen assessing her subjects. His fated mate, clearly. The Luna. On the Alpha King's other side stood another young man, handsome, with the same regal bearing as Cassius, but darker, more dangerous. His arms were crossed over his chest, his expression bored. Another brother, Thalia guessed. The pack had 3 princes. Behind the Alpha King stood 2 massive men, the Beta and Gamma based on their positions. Both looked like they could tear a person apart with their bare hands and not lose sleep over it. The servants formed lines in front of the dais, heads bowed, bodies still. Thalia mimicked their posture, keeping her eyes down, trying to disappear. The Alpha King began to speak. Thalia couldn't hear him, of course, but she watched his mouth, his body language, the reactions of those around her, and slowly, piece by piece, she assembled the meaning. Tomorrow. War. Enemies. Victory. The Alpha King's pride was visible in every gesture, every movement. He spoke like a man who'd never lost a battle, who couldn't conceive of losing this one. His hand rested on the sword at his hip, casual, confident, threatening. Then he began walking down the line of servants. Thalia's heart hammered as he approached. He was even more overwhelming up close, power radiating off him like heat from a forge. His eyes moved over each servant with predatory assessment, like he was measuring worth and finding most of them wanting. He stopped directly in front of Thalia. She didn't lower her eyes. Couldn't explain why. Some stubborn part of her, the part that had survived stones and fire and 4 years of hell, refused to cower. The Alpha King's eyes narrowed slightly. For a moment, Thalia thought he might say something to her specifically. But then he moved on, continuing down the line. When he reached the end, he turned to face them all. His mouth moved in sharp, commanding bursts. Thalia caught fragments by reading lips, by watching reactions. Rules. Obedience. Loyalty. No one leaves. Not once. Until I return. The servants around her went rigid. Thalia saw fear flash across faces, saw hands clench into fists. Anyone who breaks my laws will lose their heads. I may not be here, but I always know. Always watching. A threat. Clear and absolute. The Alpha King's hand moved to his sword hilt, a casual gesture loaded with meaning. Then he turned sharply on his heel and strode toward the exit, his mate, his brothers, his Beta and Gamma following like a dark tide. The warriors fell in behind them, boots echoing on marble, a river of violence flowing out the doors. The hall slowly emptied. Servants remained frozen until the last warrior disappeared, then exhaled collectively, shoulders sagging. Thalia stood perfectly still, her mind racing. No one leaves the pack house. Not once. Until the Alpha King returns. Which meant she couldn't go to Lysander, couldn't bring him food or medicine, or even check if he was still breathing. Couldn't do the one thing that had driven her to beg for this position in the first place. She'd succeeded in getting hired, and in doing so, she'd sentenced her brother to die alone. The irony was so brutal it made her knees weak. Around her, servants began dispersing to their duties, voices low, expressions troubled. Thalia remained where she was, staring at the empty dais where the Alpha King had stood, at the doors he'd walked through, at the future she'd just lost. She'd survived the selection. passed the impossible test, earned her position. And it meant nothing. Because while she worked inside these walls, Lysander would be dying in their shed, wondering why his sister never came home. Chapter 3. The servants' quarters were cramped and cold, tucked away in the northern wing of the pack house, where no warmth from the great fireplaces ever reached. Stone walls wept with moisture, and the single narrow window let in drafts that made the torches gutter and smoke. 10 narrow beds lined the walls, thin mattresses on wooden frames, barely wider than Thalia's shoulders. Each had a rough woolen blanket and a small trunk at its foot for personal belongings. 9 beds were already claimed. The selected maids had moved in while Thalia was still scrubbing the dining hall, staking their territory with the efficiency of wolves claiming hunting grounds. They'd taken the beds farthest from the door, away from the drafts, closest to the single brazier that provided pathetic heat. Thalia stood in the doorway with her leather pouch, everything she owned clutched against her chest, looking at the one remaining bed. Except it wasn't there anymore. The blonde in green silk, Thalia still didn't know her name, sat on the bed that should have been Thalia's, her feet propped on the trunk, her expression daring Thalia to object. The other maids watched with barely concealed amusement, their mouths forming words Thalia could read easily enough. She thought she'd actually get to sleep here. The cursed girl doesn't belong with us. She can sleep outside like the dog she is. The blonde gestured sharply toward the door, then the hallway beyond. The meaning was crystal clear. Get out. Thalia could have fought, could have stood her ground, insisted on her right to the bed she'd earned. But fighting would draw attention, would bring Morgana, who'd be only too happy to find a reason to dismiss the deaf-mute servant who'd embarrassed her. And if Thalia was dismissed, she'd never be able to help Lysander. So she bowed her head, acceptance, submission, defeat, and turned back toward the hallway. Good, she read on the blonde's lips. Know your place. The other maids laughed, the sound visible in their shaking shoulders, their gleaming eyes. They'd won this small battle, established the hierarchy, reminded the cursed girl that passing one test didn't make her equal. Thalia walked down the corridor until she found an alcove, barely more than a recessed doorway, just wide enough for a body to curl into. The stone floor was freezing even through her thin dress, and the draft from a nearby window cut through her like knives. But she'd slept in worse. She'd spent 4 years in a shed with holes in the roof, huddled against Lysander to share body heat, listening to wolves howl in the forest, and praying they wouldn't come closer. She'd spent countless nights shivering in the rain, hiding under bridges, pressing herself into shadows, while villagers hunted for the cursed children to drive away. Cold stone and cruel maids were nothing she hadn't survived before. Thalia lowered herself to the floor, drawing her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around herself. The leather pouch she pressed close, the wooden wolf Lysander had carved, her mother's blood-stained dress scrap, the 3 copper coins that were useless now. She thought of Lysander alone in their shed. Had he woken yet? Was he confused about why she hadn't returned? Was he scared? I'm sorry, she thought, though he couldn't hear it. I'm so sorry. I tried. She'd tried so hard, endured the mockery at the gates, survived Morgana's impossible test, earned this position through blood and exhaustion, and sheer, desperate refusal to fail. And it still wasn't enough. Because while she was locked inside these walls, forbidden to leave on pain of death, Lysander was dying. And there was nothing she could do about it. Nyx whimpered in her mind, a sound of pure anguish. We have to go to him. We have to help him. We can't, the Alpha King's orders. Then the orders are wrong. Our pup needs us. I know, but knowing didn't change anything. Didn't make the walls any less solid, or the consequences any less deadly. If she left, she'd be executed. And then Lysander would die anyway, without even the hope of her return. So Thalia sat in her cold alcove and tried not to think about her brother's blue-tinged lips, his shallow breathing, his fevered body growing colder as the night wore on. She tried not to think about how long it took someone to die of starvation. She tried not to think at all. Eventually, exhaustion dragged her under. Not sleep, exactly. More like the body's surrender to depletion. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her muscles cramping from the cold, her bones aching against unforgiving stone. And then something struck her leg, hard enough to jolt her awake, pain blooming up her shin. Thalia's eyes flew open to chaos. Servants running past her alcove, not walking, running. Their faces pale with panic, their mouths forming urgent words. Guards sprinting in full armor, weapons drawn. Older household staff emerging from chambers in nightclothes, confusion written across their features. Something was wrong. Catastrophically wrong. But Thalia couldn't understand what. She pushed herself upright, her body screaming in protest, and grabbed the arm of a passing maid. Not one of the new selections. Someone older. The woman jerked away like Thalia had burned her, her mouth moving in sharp, frightened bursts. "Let go! Emergency! The king!" Then she yanked free and disappeared into the chaos. Thalia stood frozen in the corridor as bodies flowed past her like a river around a stone. She caught fragments of information from reading lips, from watching expressions, from piecing together the panic. Injured, dying, silver poison. But who? What happened? Why was everyone running? A guard nearly knocked her over in his rush toward the main wings. Thalia stumbled back against the wall, her heart hammering, her wolf pacing anxiously in her mind. Something's wrong. Something's very wrong. But she had no way to ask, no way to understand, no way to do anything except stand in her alcove and watch the pack house tear itself apart around her while she remained trapped in her silent, incomprehensible world. Pain. That was the first thing that broke through the darkness. Pain so absolute, so all-consuming, that it erased everything else. Thought, memory, identity. There was only pain and the desperate animal need to escape it. Corvinus tried to open his eyes and couldn't. Tried to move and felt his body refuse, like his limbs belonged to someone else. Tried to breathe and choked on something wet and thick that tasted like copper and death. Voices surrounded him, urgent, panicked, too loud and too far away at the same time. Hands pressed against his body, moving him, hurting him, and he wanted to snarl at them to stop, but his throat wouldn't work. His wolf was silent. That terrified him more than anything else. His wolf, the creature that had been his constant companion since his first shift at 13, the source of his strength and power and identity as Alpha, was gone. Or dying. Or so weak it couldn't even surface to help heal the wounds that were definitely killing them. Both. What happened? Memory came in fragments, shattered glass cutting through the fog of agony. The ambush in the forest. They'd been winning, his warriors crushing the Shadow Fang Pack's forces, driving them back toward their own territory. Victory had tasted like blood and triumph on his tongue. Then everything changed. The enemy Alpha, Fenrir, massive and scarred, had come at him with a roar that shook the trees. They'd fought like titans, tearing chunks from each other, both refusing to yield. Evenly matched, brutal. Until Fenrir's beta emerged from the shadows with a blade. Silver. Pure silver. forged specifically to kill wolves. The metal that burned like acid, that prevented healing, that turned wounds into death sentences. The blade had caught Corvinus in the side, sliding between ribs with surgical precision. He'd felt the silver poison spreading immediately, fire in his veins, his wolf howling in agony and then going silent, his legs giving out beneath him. He remembered falling, remembered Cassius screaming his name, cutting through enemies to reach him, remembered being lifted, carried, the world tilting and spinning and fading. Then nothing. Until now. Until this moment of consciousness that felt more like torture than rescue. Losing him. The poison spreading too fast. Pressure on the wound. More pressure. Where's the pack healer? Someone get the pack healer. Corvinus forced his eyes open through sheer stubborn will. His vision was blurred, darkness creeping in from the edges, but he could make out shapes. His chamber. The ceiling he'd stared at 1,000 times. Torches casting flickering light that hurt his eyes. And faces. So many faces, all tight with fear. Cassius leaned over him, his hands pressed to Corvinus's side. Blood, Corvinus's blood, covering his arms to the elbows. His brother's face was pale as death, his eyes wide with something Corvinus had never seen there before. Terror. Pure, absolute terror. Stay with me, Cassius said, his voice breaking. Corvinus, stay with me. You don't get to die. You hear me? You don't get to fucking die. Behind him, Beta Theron barked orders at servants who scrambled to obey. Gamma Aldrich stood at the door, keeping the hallway clear, his massive body a barrier against the chaos beyond. And beside the bed, the pack healer, an elderly woman named Selene who'd been treating injuries since before Corvinus was born, worked with hands that moved too fast to follow. Packing wounds with herbs, pouring something foul-smelling into his mouth, pressing poultices against his side that burned even worse than the silver. The poison's in his bloodstream, Selene said, her voice grim. His wolf is too weak to fight it. If we don't get it out, then get it out, Cassius snarled. I'm trying, but silver poisoning. She shook her head, fear flickering across her weathered face. I need help. Get me healers Morrigan and Thomas. Now. Servants scattered. More people crowded into the room. Healers Corvinus vaguely recognized, their faces grave as they assessed his wounds. Hands pressed against his body, probing, hurting, trying to save him. Corvinus tried to speak, tried to tell them he was fine, that he'd survived worse, that an Alpha King didn't die from a coward's blade in the dark. But no sound came out except a wet gurgle that tasted like blood. His lungs collapsed, one of the healers said. The blade must have punctured. Fix it! I'm trying, but if the silver... Corvinus's vision darkened, the voices faded. Pain receded to something distant and cold. He felt himself slipping away, falling into darkness that felt almost peaceful after the agony. His wolf stirred weakly. Don't leave. The pack needs you. Your brothers need you. Don't leave. But leaving felt so easy. So much easier than fighting. We're losing him, Selene's voice sharp with panic. His heart. Hands on his chest. Pressure. Pain slamming back into him with vicious intensity. His body convulsed, arching off the bed, every nerve screaming. Then darkness again. Blessed, quiet darkness. When Corvinus surfaced again, seconds or minutes or hours later, impossible to tell, the room had gone silent. The frantic energy had shifted to something heavier, more final. He forced his eyes open to find Selene standing beside his bed, her hands covered in his blood, her expression defeated. Cassius stood across from her, his face a mask of barely controlled rage and grief. Behind him, Theron and Aldrich looked like statues carved from stone. Tell me, Cassius demanded, his voice deadly quiet. Selene took a breath that shook her entire frame. We've done everything we can. Extracted the blade fragments, packed the wounds, administered every antidote and healing potion we have. She paused, and Corvinus saw tears gathering in her ancient eyes. But the silver poison has spread too far. Into his blood, his organs, his bones. His wolf is too weak to heal him. His body is shutting down. How long? Cassius's voice barely made sound. Hours. Maybe less. I'm sorry, Prince Cassius. I'm so sorry. The room remained silent for a long moment. Corvinus watched his brother's face cycle through denial, rage, and finally, terrifyingly, acceptance. Get out, Cassius said quietly. All of you. I want to be alone with my brother. My lord. Get out! They left. Slowly, reluctantly, but they left. Until only Cassius remained, standing beside Corvinus's bed, looking down at him with eyes that held too much grief for one person to carry. Corvinus tried to speak, managed only a whisper that barely qualified as sound. Not your fault. Shut up. Cassius sank into the chair beside the bed, his head dropping into his bloody hands. Just shut up and stay alive. That's an order. But they both knew orders didn't work on death. Corvinus felt his consciousness slipping again, the darkness reaching up to claim him. His wolf had gone completely silent, not dead yet, but close enough that it made no difference. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was his brother's face, twisted with anguish, as Cassius gripped his hand like he could somehow keep Corvinus tethered to life through will alone. It wasn't enough. Nothing was enough. The Alpha King was dying, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Chapter 4, 7 Days. 7 days since the silver blade had carved Corvinus's life into before and after. 7 days of lying in this bed, staring at walls that felt like prison bars, while his body slowly knitted itself back together in all the wrong ways. Corvinus gripped the armrests of the wheeled chair, a contraption of wood and iron that some well-meaning healer had commissioned, like mobility was a comfort, when what it actually represented was everything he'd lost. His hands shook with the effort of holding himself upright, muscles that had once lifted full-grown wolves now struggling with his own weight. The wounds had healed. Mostly. Silver poisoning didn't kill cleanly. It took its time, left scars that went deeper than flesh. His side was a mass of twisted tissue, still tender when he breathed too deeply. The collapsed lung had reinflated, but every breath felt shallow, insufficient. His wolf was there, a weak presence in the back of his mind, but so diminished it felt like an echo of what it had been. And his legs. Corvinus stared at them, useless things that wouldn't respond no matter how hard he willed them to move. The healers said the silver had damaged his spine, that the paralysis might be temporary, that with time and the right herbs he might regain function. Might. That word had become his entire world. Might walk again. Might shift again. Might father heirs. Might be an alpha worth following. Might as well be dead. He hadn't left this chamber in 7 days. Hadn't allowed anyone except healers and his brothers to see him like this. Broken, useless, sitting in a chair like some elderly wolf past his prime. His pride wouldn't allow it. Couldn't allow it. The Umbral Crescent Pack had an Alpha King who conquered enemies and ruled with absolute authority, not this hollow shell wearing his face. So he stayed hidden, took the herbs Selene prescribed, foul-tasting concoctions that promised healing but delivered only nausea and false hope, refused visitors, refused council meetings, refused to acknowledge the reality of what he'd become. The door opened without a knock. Corvinus's head snapped up, a snarl building in his chest. I said no visitors. That died when he saw who stood in the doorway. Seraphine, his fated mate. The woman the moon goddess herself had chosen for him. The future Luna of his pack. She looked like captured sunlight, golden hair perfectly arranged, violet eyes bright, wearing a dress of deep blue that made her skin glow. Beautiful, breathtaking, everything a Luna should be. And she was looking at him with an expression that made his blood run cold. Not concern, not relief that he'd survived. Something else entirely. Something calculated and cruel. Seraphine. His voice came out rougher than intended, weeks of disuse making it sound like gravel. You came. She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her with a soft click that felt ominous. Her heels clicked against stone as she moved to stand near the window, deliberately keeping distance between them. I did, she said, her tone conversational. Light. Like they were discussing weather rather than his near death. Finally. Something in that word, finally, sent warning bells through Corvinus's mind. I haven't seen you in days. 5 days. He'd counted. Each day she didn't visit, each absence that spoke louder than words. Seraphine smiled. It was the smile a predator wore before striking. Did you expect me to sit beside your sickbed, holding your hand, weeping for your recovery? You're my mate, my fated mate. I was. She examined her nails, the picture of boredom. Past tense, important distinction. Corvinus's wolf stirred weakly, sensing danger. What are you saying? Seraphine turned to face him fully, and the pity in her eyes was worse than hatred would have been. I'm saying I didn't come here to check on you, Corvinus. I came to collect my jewelry. The pieces I left in your chamber before you so foolishly got yourself nearly killed. Each word landed like a physical blow. Seraphine. Did you know the healers talk? She moved to his dresser, opening the top drawer where she'd kept her things. Necklaces, rings, earrings. All gifts he'd given her during their courtship. They whisper in corridors, discuss their patients like we can't hear. It's really quite indiscreet. Corvinus's chest tightened. What did they say? That the silver didn't just paralyze your legs. Seraphine began collecting jewelry, dropping pieces into a velvet pouch with casual efficiency. It damaged other parts of you. Important parts. The parts that would let you give me heirs. No. That's not confirmed, Corvinus forced out. Celine said it's too early to know, but probable. Seraphine turned to face him, jewelry pouch in hand, her expression pitiless. Very probable. So tell me, Corvinus, why would I chain myself to a crippled alpha who can't walk, can't shift, and can't give me the children I deserve? The words hit him like silver bullets, each one finding its mark with surgical precision. Because we're fated mates. Because the moon goddess made a mistake. Seraphine's voice was cold enough to freeze blood. Or perhaps she has a cruel sense of humor. Either way, I'm not laughing. Corvinus tried to move, to stand, to close the distance between them and make her see reason. His hands gripped the armrests, his muscles straining with effort that should have been effortless. His legs remained motionless, useless. Seraphine watched his struggle with something like satisfaction. You can't even stand to face me. Can't chase me if I walk away. Can't do anything except sit in that chair and watch while I choose someone better. Someone better? The words came out strangled. Your brother. Seraphine's smile widened. Malachi. He's whole, strong, capable of giving me everything you can't. He'll make an excellent mate once I sever the bond between us. Pain exploded through Corvinus's chest. Not physical, but somehow worse. The mate bond, that golden thread that had connected them since they'd first recognized each other, began to fray. To tear. You can't. Desperation made his voice crack. The severance rite requires both parties to consent, or one party to formally reject the other in the presence of pack witnesses. Seraphine reached into her pouch and pulled out a rolled parchment, sealed with the pack's official crest. I took the liberty of filing the petition with the elders yesterday. They were very understanding, given your condition. The fraying intensified. Corvinus felt it like physical pain, worse than any wound, as the bond that had defined his future began to dissolve. Seraphine, please. I, Seraphine of the Northern Territories, formally reject you, Corvinus, Alpha King of the Umbral Crescent Pack, as my fated mate. Her voice was clear, ritual words spoken with the weight of finality. Our bond is severed. Our future ends here. I choose another. The bond snapped. Corvinus felt it tear away, leaving raw, bleeding emptiness where it had lived. His wolf howled in anguish, a sound so broken it made his vision blur. Every nerve in his body screamed, pain radiating outward from his chest like he'd been stabbed through the heart. And through it all, Seraphine stood there watching him break, her expression calm. I did love you once, she said softly, tucking the parchment away. Before this, when you were an alpha worth loving. But I refuse to spend my life caring for a cripple who can't even defend his own pack. You understand, don't you? Corvinus couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, could only sit in his chair and feel everything inside him crumble. Seraphine moved to the door, pausing with her hand on the handle. Malachi will visit you later. He feels guilty, though I can't imagine why. It's not his fault the Shadow Fang Pack destroyed you. She opened the door. Wait. Corvinus finally found his voice, thick with desperation. Don't leave, please. We can fix this. I can heal. Goodbye, Corvinus. She walked out. Just walked out, taking her jewelry and his future with her, leaving him sitting in his chair like the broken, useless thing he'd become. Corvinus stared at the empty doorway, at the space where his mate, his former mate, had stood moments ago, so beautiful and so cruel. At the parchment she'd left on his dresser, official seal glinting in torchlight, documenting the end of everything. His hands gripped the armrests hard enough to make the wood creak. His wolf surged up, weak but furious, slamming against his consciousness with rage that had nowhere to go. She'd left him, severed their bond, chosen his brother, called him broken and useless and crippled. The roar tore out of Corvinus's throat before he could stop it. Not a human sound, not even a wolf sound. Something primal and anguished that came from the deepest part of his shattered soul. It echoed through his chamber, through the corridors beyond, through the entire pack house. A sound of such pure agony and rage that it made the air itself seem to vibrate. Somewhere in the distance, Corvinus heard glass shatter, heard servants scream, heard his name shouted in alarm. But he couldn't stop. The roar went on, pulling everything dark and broken out of him, laying his devastation bare for anyone close enough to hear. His hands slammed against the armrests, again and again, trying to destroy something, anything, to match what had been destroyed inside him. Footsteps thundered toward his chamber. The door burst open. Cassius rushed in, Theron right behind him, both looking wild-eyed and armed like they expected an attack. They found their Alpha King alone in his chair, throat raw from screaming, eyes burning with unshed tears he refused to let fall, staring at nothing while his world continued to collapse around him. Corvinus? Cassius approached slowly, carefully like approaching a wounded animal. What happened? We heard... She's gone. Corvinus's voice was destroyed, barely recognizable. She severed the bond. She chose Malachi. She called me. He couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't say the word cripple out loud. Couldn't give it that power. Cassius's expression shifted from confusion to horror to murderous rage in the space of a heartbeat. She what? Get out. Corvinus couldn't look at him. Couldn't bear the pity he knew he'd see. Both of you, leave me alone. Corvinus, that's an order! The Alpha command cracked through the room like lightning. Both Cassius and Theron stumbled back, their wolves forced to submit, even though every instinct probably screamed at them to stay. They left. They had no choice. And Corvinus sat alone in his chamber, in his chair, surrounded by the wreckage of who he'd been, staring at the jewelry she'd left behind, the necklace he'd given her to celebrate their mating ceremony, the one she hadn't bothered to take because it meant nothing to her now. His fated mate had abandoned him. His body was broken. His wolf was dying. His pride, the thing that had defined him his entire life, lay in pieces at his feet. And there was nothing, absolutely nothing he could do about any of it except sit in this chair and feel it all slowly destroy him from the inside out. The roar built in his chest again, quieter this time, but no less anguished. And Corvinus let it come. Chapter 5. Deaths. More deaths after another. Servants. Maids. Everyone who dared to go closer to the Alpha. In 6 days, the lives of maids stolen by the devastated Alpha were greater than 20. Thalia had counted them in the only way she could, by watching bodies carried out on stretchers, covered in white sheets that couldn't hide the blood seeping through, by seeing faces in the morning that were gone by evening, by the way the remaining servants huddled together in corners, their mouths forming prayers to gods who clearly weren't listening. The pack house had become a tomb. A beautiful Gothic tomb where death lived in the Alpha King's chambers, and no one could escape it. The first maid, a girl named Alara with kind eyes, who'd once smiled at Thalia in the kitchen, had been sent to bring the Alpha King his breakfast on the second day after his mate's betrayal. She'd entered his chambers carrying a tray of food and healing tonics. She never came out. When guards finally forced the door open hours later, they found her body broken against the far wall, her neck snapped, the breakfast tray shattered on the floor. And the Alpha King, sitting in his wheeled chair, staring at nothing, blood on his hands. The second and third maids went together, sent to clean his chambers. One lasted 5 minutes before her screams brought guards running. The other managed 10 before silence fell. By the fourth death, servants started refusing assignments to the Alpha King's chambers, started begging Morgana to send anyone else, to give them any other task. Even the most degrading work in the pack house would be preferable to entering that room. By the 8th death, resignations began. Servants who'd worked for the pack for years suddenly remembered family emergencies in distant territories, packed their belongings in the dead of night and fled before dawn, willing to break their contracts and face consequences rather than risk being the next body carried out under a sheet. By the 15th death, the pack house staff had been cut in half. Those who remained did so either because they had nowhere else to go, or because, like Thalia, they had reasons that outweighed their terror. Because the chaos was perfect for smuggling. With guards distracted by the crisis in the Alpha King's chambers, with Morgana running between council meetings and damage control, with the entire household in upheaval, no one noticed when small portions of food went missing from the kitchens. No one counted the extra loaves of bread baked each morning. No one saw Thalia slipping out through the servants' entrance after midnight, a bundle of stolen food clutched against her chest. For 6 days, Thalia had been able to reach Lysander. Her brother was still alive. Barely. still breathing in their shed, his fever burning through his small body, his ribs visible through his skin, but alive, sustained by the food Thalia brought, the medicine she'd stolen from the pack, house healers' stores while everyone was distracted by death. She couldn't leave, couldn't resign like the others, no matter how much terror clawed at her throat every time another body was carried past. Because leaving meant Lysander starved, meant abandoning the only chance she had to keep him breathing. So Thalia stayed, worked, kept her head down, and prayed to gods who'd never answered her that she wouldn't be the next one sent to the Alpha King's chambers. Now she stood in the pack house kitchen, dawn light filtering through high windows, her hands moving automatically through the familiar motions of preparing breakfast, kneading dough, chopping vegetables, stirring porridge over the fire. Around her, the remaining kitchen staff worked in near silence. The usual chatter and gossip had died with the first maid. Now they moved like ghosts, speaking only when necessary, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. The blonde maid, Thalia had learned her name was Vela through reading lips, stood at the far counter, her hands shaking as she tried to dice carrots. Every few seconds she'd glance toward the door, like expecting death itself to walk through. Two other maids huddled near the ovens, whispering urgently. Thalia caught fragments of their conversation by reading lips. Heard she lasted less than a minute. Clawed right through. Can't even shift and he's still. Who's next? Do you think they'll make us draw lots? The door opened. Every person in the kitchen froze. Knives stopped mid-chop, spoons halted mid-stir. Every face turned toward the entrance, terror written in their eyes. But it wasn't Morgana bringing death assignments. It was Prince Cassius. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, his hair disheveled like he'd been running his hands through it, his clothes rumpled, like he hadn't slept in days. Which he probably hadn't based on the whispers Thalia had caught about him trying desperately to manage his brother's rage. His eyes scanned the kitchen, moving over each servant until they landed on Thalia. Something in his expression shifted, softened slightly. He walked toward her, his movements careful, non-threatening. The other servants parted like water around a stone, giving him space, their relief at not being his target visible on their faces. Cassius stopped a few feet from Thalia's workstation. She set down her knife, wiping her flour-covered hands on her apron, her heart hammering. He said something, his lips forming words Thalia couldn't hear. A question, based on the upward inflection, the slight tilt of his head. She pointed to her ears, her mouth, shaking her head. The universal gesture she'd made 1,000 times. I can't hear you. Frustration flickered across Cassius's face. He tried again, slower this time, exaggerating each word. But Thalia still couldn't understand. Lip reading only worked when she knew the context, when words made sense together. Cassius's hands moved, awkward, uncertain attempts at sign language, but his gestures were wrong. Nonsensical. He clearly didn't know any formal signs, was just trying to communicate through instinct. It wasn't working. Thalia watched him struggle, saw the determination in his eyes, the refusal to give up. And despite everything, despite the deaths and the terror and the exhaustion pressing down on her, she felt something almost like warmth in her chest. He was trying. Actually trying to speak to her, to bridge the gap her disabilities created. No one had tried in 4 years. Then Cassius's expression changed, like he'd just remembered something. His eyes widened slightly, and he took a step closer. And then, "Can you hear me?" The voice exploded into Thalia's mind, not through her ears, not as sound, but as thought crystal clear and unmistakable, resonating through her consciousness like someone had spoken directly into her soul. "Thalia, can you hear this?" She gasped, actually gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, her eyes going wide with shock so absolute it made her dizzy. A voice, a real voice, not the muted, underwater echoes she sometimes imagined when watching people speak. Not the hollow silence that had been her entire existence since birth. An actual voice. Clear and warm and real, speaking her name inside her head. Oh gods, it worked. Cassius's mental voice carried relief and wonder in equal measure. "You can hear me." The mind link, I didn't know if it would work with you, but... Thalia's own thoughts felt strange, loud as she directed them toward him. "I can hear you. I can actually hear you." Yes, the royal bloodline, alpha bloodline. We can communicate with pack members through the mind link. I should have thought of it sooner. I just wasn't sure if your deafness would... He stopped himself. How does it feel? How did it feel? Like being given the sun after 18 years of darkness. Like breathing for the first time. Like every prayer she'd ever sent into the void had finally, impossibly, been answered. Tears blurred Thalia's vision. She felt them spill down her cheeks. Hot, uncontrollable, carrying 4 years of isolation and loneliness, and desperate, aching need to be understood. "Thank you," she thought at him, her mental voice breaking. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." She couldn't stop the tears, couldn't stop the smile that spread across her face despite them, wide and genuine, and so bright it hurt. Her hands trembled as she pressed them together, then swept them toward Cassius in that gesture she'd taught herself. Thank you, but now accompanied by actual words he could hear in his mind. In my whole life, I've never heard a voice. Not even my mother's. Not even my own. And now I can hear yours, and it's... She couldn't finish. Too many emotions crowding her throat, making even mental speech impossible. Cassius's expression had gone soft in a way Thalia had never seen before. Not pity. Something else. Something that looked almost like pain mixed with wonder. "You're welcome," he said gently through the mind link. "I wish I'd thought of it sooner. You shouldn't have had to go through all of this without anyone able to speak to you properly. But you're speaking to me now." Thalia wiped at her tears with the back of her hand, still smiling through them. "That's what matters." They stood there for a moment, connected by something more intimate than words spoken aloud could ever be. The mind link thrummed between them, warm and real, a bridge across the isolation that had defined Thalia's existence. Then Cassius's expression shifted. Back to reality. Back to the crisis consuming the pack house. "I wanted to check on you," he said. "Make sure you were all right, that the other servants weren't." He paused. "Are they treating you well?" Thalia thought of sleeping in cold alcoves, of beds stolen and mockery constant. But compared to stones and fire and 4 years of surviving alone, it was nothing. "Well enough," she answered, which wasn't exactly a lie. Cassius's eyes narrowed slightly, like he knew she was holding back. But he didn't press. "If anyone hurts you, anyone at all, you tell me. You understand? The mind link works across distances. If you need me, just think my name loudly, and I'll hear you." Something fierce and protective colored his mental voice, and Thalia felt her chest tighten with an emotion she didn't have a name for. "I understand," she thought back. "Thank you for everything, for giving me this job, for defending me, for..." She gestured vaguely at her head. "For this." "You earned the job yourself. I just made sure you got the chance." Cassius offered her a small smile. "I should go. My brother needs..." His expression darkened. "I have responsibilities. But remember what I said. You need me. You call." "I will." He turned toward the door, and Thalia felt the mind link stretched between them like a golden thread, growing thinner with distance, but not breaking. Then he stopped, looking back. One more thing. Your brother, Lysander, right? How is he? Thalia's breath caught. You know about him? You signed about him when I asked if you had family, that first day. Cassius's mental voice gentled. Is he still sick? Yes, very sick, but I've been able to. She stopped, suddenly uncertain how much to reveal about her nighttime smuggling. You've been sneaking food to him. Not a question. A statement. Thalia froze, panic flooding through her. It's all right. Cassius raised a hand in a calming gesture. I'm not going to stop you. The no-leaving rule was my brother's order, and in his current state, I'm not about to bring it up. Just, he paused. Be careful. If you get caught... I know. Execution. Yes. And I can't protect you from that. Not if you're caught directly violating the Alpha King's command. His mental voice carried weight. Warning. So don't get caught. I won't, Thalia promised, though they both knew promises meant nothing in the face of desperate need. Cassius nodded once, then left. The kitchen door closed behind him, and Thalia stood there, her hands still trembling, tears still drying on her cheeks. For the first time in 18 years, she'd heard a voice. For the first time since the fire, someone had asked about Lysander like he mattered. For the first time since arriving at the pack house, she felt almost like a person instead of a burden to be endured. The moment shattered when the door opened again. Morgana entered, her black skirt swishing, her face hard as stone. Her eyes swept the kitchen, and when they landed on Thalia, something cold and triumphant flickered in them. The other servants went silent. Everyone knew what Morgana's presence meant these days. Death assignments. Morgana's lips moved, speaking to the kitchen at large, but her eyes never left Thalia. It's your turn, Thalia read on her lips. The Alpha King's chambers. Now. The world tilted sideways. Around her, the other servants' faces showed relief, terrible, guilty relief that it wasn't them. Vela actually sagged against the counter, her hands pressed to her mouth. Thalia's mind raced. This was it. The death she'd been avoiding for 6 days was finally here, inevitable as winter. She could refuse, could resign right now, walk out the servants' entrance and never come back. But that meant Lysander died. And if she went to the Alpha King's chambers, she'd probably die anyway. Either way, her brother lost his sister. Morgana gestured sharply. Move! The Alpha is waiting. And when he waits, he gets angrier. Thalia's legs felt like water. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. But she set down her knife, untied her apron, walked toward Morgana on legs that barely supported her weight. Because refusing meant Lysander starved immediately. Going meant maybe, just maybe, she'd survive. Against all odds. Against 20 dead servants and 6 days of slaughter. Maybe she'd be different. Maybe the gods who'd cursed her with silence would show mercy now. Or maybe she'd just be the 21st body carried out under a blood-stained sheet. Either way, she was about to find out. End of part 1. If you have stayed until the end, it means you're enjoying the story. Part 2 comes out on Thursday, as the story just begins. Thank you for listening. Your like, comment, and subscription will help this new channel go a long way.